The sound of the car trunk closing still echoes in my mind like a gunshot in the silence. David looked at me one last time through the fogged-up car window, his dark eyes filled with a coldness I had never seen. The words came out of his mouth like sharp blades cutting through the icy air. "This is over, Emily." Just like that, 7 years of dating, 2 of marriage, and a baby growing inside me, all summed up in 3 words spoken in his usual neutral tone, as if he wanted to make sure I fully understood the weight of his decision. The engine purred for a few seconds before gaining strength, and I watched, paralyzed, as the car's taillights became red dots in the vast white expanse that surrounded us. The wind cut across my face with the precision of 1,000 small knives, and only then did I realize I was trembling, not just from the cold, but from shock, from fear, from a rage that was beginning to bubble in my chest like incandescent lava. I was left alone, completely alone, on a road that seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions, surrounded by snow-covered pine trees and a silence so profound I could hear my own heart beating desperate. The sky was gray, heavy with low clouds that promised more snow, and I had no idea where I was. David had driven for hours since our last stop at a gas station, taking detours and back roads that I couldn't follow on the map. I held my bulging belly with both hands, feeling the baby stir restless, as if he too sensed the danger. I was in my 7th month of pregnancy, and every movement of my unborn son reminded me of the responsibility I carried. It was no longer just about me, it was about us. The certainty hit me like a lightning bolt. If I wanted us both to survive, I needed to move. Staying there, waiting for someone to pass on this abandoned road, was a slow death sentence. I looked at the car tracks in the snow, already beginning to be covered by the flakes that fell persistently from the sky. David wouldn't be back. There was something in his gaze, a finality that I recognized, even without wanting to admit it. He had planned this, maybe not since the beginning of our trip, but certainly in the last few days, when his behavior had become strange, distant, almost cruel. I remembered the argument we had the night before, at the cheap motel where we stopped. He was nervous, constantly looking at his phone, speaking in a low voice when making calls that he would end as soon as I approached. When I asked what was going on, he just said it was work stuff and that I didn't need to worry. But there were lies in his eyes, and I knew them well, after all these years together. The cold was becoming unbearable. My coat, though thick, was not enough for the temperatures we were facing. My hands were already numb, and I could feel the ice forming on my eyelash. I needed to find shelter, and fast. I started walking in the opposite direction from which the car had gone, just out of instinct. I wanted to get as far away from David as possible. Every step was a struggle. The snow reached my knees in some spots, and my pregnant state made every movement more difficult. The baby seemed to sense my anguish and was constant, causing me discomfort and reminding me that I wasn't just fighting for my own life. After walking for about an hour, with my feet already aching and my hands completely numb, I started to despair. The road seemed to stretch infinitely, with no sign of civilization in any direction. The sky was getting darker, and I knew that when night came, my chances of survival would decrease dramatically. It was then that I saw something that made my heart race, a thin line of smoke rising between the trees, at a distance that was hard to calculate. For a moment, I hesitated. Was it real? Or was my desperate mind creating mirages to keep me going? The smoke seemed faint, almost ethereal against the gray sky, but it was there. I was sure it was there. The smoke became clearer with every step I took toward the trees. But the path was not easy. The wind seemed to have a life of its own, blowing against me with a force that made me stumble every few. It was as if nature itself was trying to push me back to the road, warning me against the decision to venture into the forest. My hands burned in a way I had never experienced. The cold had gone from numbness to a sharp pain that shot up my arms and spread across my chest. Every time I tried to use my hands to support myself when climbing a small incline or to balance while crossing a fallen log, the pain intensified to the point of almost making. My legs were in no better condition. The muscles in my thighs burned with every step, and my knees seemed about to give way under the combined weight of my body and the baby I was carrying. Several times I thought about giving up, about simply sitting in the snow and waiting for it all to end. It would be easier. it would be fast. But then I heard my mother's voice echoing in my mind, as clear as if she were there with me. Honey, no one can rescue if you don't rescue yourself first. They were words she had told me many times during my troubled childhood, when my father left us and we were alone in a dangerous neighborhood in Brooklyn. Mom had worked double shifts, cleaning houses in the morning and waiting tables at night, all to give me a chance at a better life. She never waited for someone to. She saved herself, and she saved me in the process. And now, lost in this frozen forest, carrying her grandson, I knew I needed to find the same strength she had found so many years ago. The memory gave me enough energy. I focused on the smoke, which now seemed definitely real and not far off. I could even smell a faint scent of burning wood in the air, mixed with the fresh aroma of snow and pine trees. Someone was there. Someone with a fire, with warmth, possibly with food and shelter. The terrain started to get steep, and I had to use the trees for support to keep from sliding downhill. Low branches scratched my face and pulled my hair, but I kept moving forward. With every step, the smoke became clearer, denser, more promising. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only 30 more minutes, a cabin appeared through the trees. It was small, built of dark logs that looked like they had withstood many winters, with a stone chimney from which the saving smoke I had followed was coming out. There was a small pile of firewood next to the door and some tools leaning against the side wall. Golden light leaked through a curtained window, creating a cozy rectangle in the white, cold landscape. For a moment, I stood there, just looking at the cabin, barely believing I had found shelter. It seemed too surreal to be true. But the cold cutting my skin was all too real, and the baby moving in my belly urgently reminded me that I had no time for hesitation. I walked to the sturdy wooden door and knocked hard, using the side of my fist because my fingers were too stiff to make a proper fist. The sound echoed inside the cabin, and I heard heavy footsteps approaching. My heart raced from relief, but also from a sudden fear. What if whoever was inside was dangerous? What if it was someone who didn't want to help me? But there was no choice. I was on the verge of collapsing from cold and exhaustion, and I knew I wouldn't be able to make it back to the road even if I wanted to. This was my only chance of survival. When the door opened, I was met by a tall, thin man with dark hair touched with gray and an unshaven beard that gave him a rugged appearance. His eyes were a deep brown, but there was something in them that made me instinctively recoil. Not exactly hostility, but a coldness that seemed to match the snow covering everything around us perfectly. He looked me up and down, taking in my state, soaked, trembling uncontrollably, obviously pregnant and clearly in danger. He didn't say a word for several seconds, just studied me as if he was trying to decide if I posed a threat or just another problem he didn't want to deal with. He pulled me inside unceremoniously, closing the door quickly behind me to keep the inside warm. The contrast between the biting cold outside and the heated atmosphere of the cabin was so intense that I felt dizzy for a moment. The interior was simple but cozy. A crackling fireplace dominated one wall, surrounded by two old but comfortable armchairs. A small wooden table occupied the center of the main space, and I could see a basic kitchen in the back, along with a door that presumably led to a bedroom. "Sit down," he said in English, pointing to one of the armchairs near the fire. His voice was deep and had a slight accent that I couldn't quite place. It sounded like a mix of something I didn't recognize. He took a thick poncho hanging on a hook on the wall and placed it over my shoulder. The fabric was rough, but incredibly warm, and I wrapped myself in it gratefully. He disappeared into the kitchen for a few minutes, and I heard the sound of water boiling and the clinking of dishes. I used the time alone to study the environment. The walls were decorated with some old black and white photographs, faces I didn't recognize, landscapes that seemed familiar but I couldn't place. There were some hand tools hung neat, and simple shelves with books in English and a few in other languages. When he returned, he carried a steaming mug that smelled of herbs and honey. "Rest," he said again, offering me the drink. I accepted gratefully, wrapping my aching hands around the warm mug. The liquid was comforting, warming me from within, and I felt some of the knots of tension in my shoulders start to unravel. As I drank the tea, I realized he was watching me with an attention that went beyond the natural curiosity of someone who had just received an unexpected and desperate visitor. His eyes scanned my face as if trying to recognize something, as if he was looking for clues as to who I was or where I came. It was an analytical, almost scientific look that made me slightly uncomfortable. "What's your name?" he asked, sitting in the armchair opposite. "Emily," I replied, my voice still hoarse from the cold and shock. "Emily Miller." He nodded slowly, as if he was filing away that information. "Gabriel," he said simply, not offering a last name. We remained in silence for several minutes, with only the sound of the crackling fire filling the space between. I was starting to feel more human again. Warmth was returning to my fingers and toes, and my breathing was normalizing. But 1,000 questions raced through my mind. Where exactly was I? How had Gabriel ended up living in this isolated place? And, more importantly, would he help me get out of there? Finally, Gabriel broke the silence. "What were you doing on the road?" His question was direct, but not aggressive. I felt a wave of emotions hit me: anger, sadness, humiliation. How to explain that my own husband had abandoned me, pregnant, in the middle of nowhere? How to admit that I had been so blind to the signs that David was changing, distancing, planning something? "My husband left me there," I managed to say finally, the words coming out more bitter than I intended. Gabriel showed no surprise or shock, just nodded as if this kind of thing was more common than I would like to believe. But then he asked something that caught me off guard. "What's your husband's name?" "David," I replied automatically. "David Johnson." What happened next was subtle, but unmistakable. I saw a slight hardening in Gabriel's gaze, an almost imperceptible tension that crossed his features. It was quick, but I had spent years learning to read micro-expressions on David's face when he lied or hid something, so I didn't miss the reaction. Gabriel knew that name. More than that, the name David Johnson meant something that was not positive. My stomach clenched with a new kind of fear. What kind of situation had I gotten myself in? "David Johnson from Portland," Gabriel asked, his voice carefully neutral. My heart raced. How did he know where David was from? Portland was a big city. It wasn't like everyone knew each other. "Yes," I replied hesitant. Gabriel leaned back in his armchair, his fingers tapping slowly on the arm of the chair. He ran a hand through his hair and sighed deep, as if he was processing complex information. "Emily," he said finally, "do you really know the man you married?" The question hit me like a punch to the stomach. It was exactly the kind of question I had been avoiding asking myself for the past few months, when David's behavior had become increasingly erratic and secretive. It was the question I had buried under layers of denial and hope that things would return to normal. But why would a complete stranger, a man I had never seen before in my life, be asking? Why did Gabriel seem to know my husband? And why had his gaze become even colder when he heard David's name? Before I could find the words to answer, Gabriel continued to speak, and what he said froze me more than all the winter outside. I spent 2 whole days recovering in Gabriel's cabin, and during that time, a strange routine was established. But he was attentive in a practical and efficient way. He brought me nutritious, hot tea, extra blankets when I shivered at night. But there was an emotional distance he maintained, as if he was taking care of me out of moral obligation rather than any kind of personal connection. Gabriel avoided talking about himself with a skill that bordered on art. Whenever I tried to ask questions about his life, how long he had lived there, what he did for a living, if he had family, he skillfully deflected the conversation to other topics or simply left the cabin to get more firewood or check on something outside. Gradually, however, I began to notice signs that he carried a deep, almost palpable sadness. They were small things: the way his shoulders slumped when he thought he wasn't being watched, the way he looked at the photographs on the wall with a melancholic expression, the moments of prolonged silence when he seemed to be lost in full memory. There was one photo in particular that caught my attention. A young, beautiful woman smiling at the camera, her dark hair dancing in the wind. She was on a beach I recognized as being somewhere in California, with palm trees in the background and turquoise water. Gabriel sometimes looked at that photo with an intensity that made my heart ache with empathy. During the long hours we spent in silence, me recovering and him busy with household chores or cabin mate, I began to reflect on my own situation. The question Gabriel had asked about really knowing David constantly echoed in my mind. How much did I really know about the man I had married? David and I met at college in Portland, where I was studying art, and he was taking business. He was charming, confident, always with an interesting story to tell, and ambitious plans for the future. He talked about business opportunities, important connections he had made, deals he was about to close. But now, looking back, I realized that those deals never materialized, and those opportunities always seemed to evaporate at the last moment. On the third day, I felt strong enough to sit near the window with some drawing materials that Gabriel had found in a drawer. I started sketching the view of the lake that stretched beyond the cabin, letting my pencil capture the soft shapes of the snow-covered hills and the partially frozen surface of the water. Art had always been my refuge, my way of processing complex emotions. Gabriel stopped behind me to observe my work. "You draw well," he commented, and it was one of the first genuinely personal things he had said since I arrived. "It's my profession," I replied, without looking up from the paper. Or it was. "I don't know what I am anymore." "You're a survivor," he said simply. I continued, drawing for a few more minutes, adding details to the trees on the opposite shore of the lake. It was then that Gabriel pulled up a chair to sit next to, and his proximity made me look at him. "Emily," he said, his voice carrying a hesitation I hadn't heard before, "do you really know the man you married?" It was the second time he had asked that question, and this time I couldn't ignore or deflect it. There was something in Gabriel's expression, a seriousness that told me he knew things about David that I didn't. "I thought I did," I admitted finally, putting the pencil aside. "But lately, I've realized there are a lot of things about him I don't understand. Strange phone calls, trips he doesn't explain well, money that appears and disappears from our accounts with no clear explanation." Gabriel nodded slowly, as if my answer confirmed something he already suspected. He got up and walked to the fireplace, keeping his back to me for several minutes. The silence stretched between us, laden with tension and expectation. "Gabriel," I said finally, "you know my husband, don't you?" He turned to face me, and I saw an internal struggle in his eyes. He was clearly debating with himself how much to tell me, whether he should tell me anything at all. "I met David a long time ago," he said finally. "When we were teenagers, I felt my heart race." "How? Where?" "In Portland. We grew up in the same neighborhood." Gabriel sat back down, but this time, he kept a greater distance. "David was always, complicated, smart, charming, but always willing to take dangerous shortcuts to get what he wanted." "What kind of shortcuts?" Gabriel hesitated again, running a hand through his hair. "He always had problems with money, Emily, and when you have problems with money in certain neighborhoods in Portland, you end up getting involved with dangerous people." I felt a cold in my stomach that had nothing to do with the weather outside. What kind of dangerous people? People who lend money at impossible interest rates. People who do favors in exchange for other favors. People who don't hesitate to use violence when they don't get what they want. Gabriel looked me directly in the eyes. "David got involved in that world when he was 17, and as far as I know, he never completely got out of it." The implications of what he was telling me began to form in my mind. The strange calls, the trips, David's growing paranoia in recent months. Everything was starting to make a terrible sense. "But that's not all," Gabriel continued, his voice becoming harsher. "Years ago, David betrayed the trust of someone very close, someone who trusted him completely." "Who?" Gabriel got up again, walking to the window. He looked at the lake for a long moment before answering. "And I wasn't the only one he did this to," he said, avoiding my question. "There's a woman you need to meet." The next day, Gabriel told me there was something I needed to see, someone I needed to meet. He seemed nervous, unlike the calm composure he had maintained since my arrival. As we ate breakfast, simple eggs and toast he had prepared, I noticed his hands trembled slightly as he held his coffee cup. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, as he grabbed the keys to an old Jeep that was parked behind the cabin. I hadn't noticed the vehicle before, hidden as it was between the trees. "Emily, you have the right to know the truth," he replied, helping me into the passenger. "But I warn you, what you're going to hear today might completely change how you see your marriage." The Jeep was old and noisy, but it worked. We drove on dirt roads that snaked through the forest, occasionally passing other isolated cabins, each with its own column of smoke rising into the gray sky. Gabriel explained that we lived in an area where many people sought isolation, fleeing problems or simply looking for a simpler life away from the complications of the city. After about 40 minutes of driving, we arrived at a small village that consisted of no more than a dozen houses, a small grocery store, and a wooden church. Gabriel stopped in front of one of the houses, a modest construction painted a faded blue, with a small front yard that was probably pretty in the summer, but was now covered in snow. He turned off the engine and turned to me. "The woman who lives here is named Isabel," he said. "She has ... history with David." My stomach clenched. "What kind of history?" "It's better to let her tell you herself," Gabriel replied, getting out of the jeep. We walked to the front door, and Gabriel knocked gently. I heard light footsteps approaching, and then the door opened, revealing a woman who looked to be in her 30s. She was pretty, with wavy brown hair and expressive green eyes, but there was a sadness on her face that reminded me of the expression I had seen in Gabriel. "Gabriel," she said, smiling faintly. Then her eyes turned to me, and I saw a flicker of recognition that confused me. How could she recognize me if we had never met? "Isabel, this is Emily," Gabriel said. "Emily Johnson." Isabel's face contracted slightly at my full name, and she nodded as if confirming something she already knew. "Come in, please," she said, opening the door completely. The interior of the house was cozy, decorated with simple but well-kept furniture. Family photographs adorned the walls, and toys were scattered on the living room rug. It was then that I heard a child's voice calling from the other room. "Mommy." A little girl, about 6 years old, appeared, running, stopping abruptly when she saw strangers in the house. She had dark, curly hair, large expressive eyes, and an appearance that made me gasp. She looked like David. The resemblance was unmistakable. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, even the way she tilted her head when she was curious. My hand automatically went to my belly, where my unborn baby moved as if sensing my anguish. "Sophia, go play in your room," Isabel said gently, but firmly. The little girl obeyed, but not before looking at me with an intense curiosity that made me even more uncomfortable. We sat in the living room, and Isabel served tea while a tense silence hung in the air. Gabriel remained quiet, allowing Isabel to tell her story at her own pace. "Gabriel told me you're married to David Johnson," Isabel began finally, her hands trembling slightly as she held her cup. "Yes," I managed to say, my voice coming out as a whisper. Isabel looked at Gabriel, who nodded encouragingly. Then she turned to me, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. "David was my fiancé," she said simply. "We lived together for 3 years. We planned to get married after saving enough money for the ceremony and a small honeymoon." I felt the world start to spin around me. When was this? 4 years ago. Sophia was 2 when he disappeared. The implications of what she was telling me were devastating. 4 years ago, I was already in a serious relationship with David. We were living together, talking about marriage. How was it possible that he was engaged to someone else at the same time? "He disappeared?" I asked, although part of me didn't want to hear the answer. "One morning I woke up and he was gone," Isabel continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "He took all his clothes, all our savings, almost $10,000 that we had saved for years, and he just left a note saying he had found a better opportunity and that I shouldn't look for him." My mind was collapsing. $10,000 was exactly the amount David had gotten from an investment right after we started talking seriously about marriage. He said he had made a smart bet on the stock market, but he could never show me convincing documents when I asked. "Isabel," Gabriel said softly, "tell Emily about Sophia." Isabel wiped her eyes and looked in the direction of the room where the little girl had disappeared. "Sophia is David's daughter," she said. "She was born during our relationship. He was there for the birth, held her in his arms, promised to be the best father in the world." I felt as if the ground was disappearing under my feet. David had a daughter, a 6-year-old daughter he had abandoned along with her mother, and now he was doing the same thing. "Emily, are you okay?" Gabriel asked, seeing my expression of shock. I couldn't answer immediately. My mind was racing, connecting dots, flipping through memory. David's frequent trips to the Midwest for business, the suspicious phone calls, the periods when he disappeared for days without a satisfactory explanation. Isabel got up and went to a drawer, from which she took a box of photographs. She came back and spread them on the coffee table. They were photos of her and David together, at parties, at the beach, in intimate moments that clearly showed a couple in love. In many of the photos, Sophia was present, still a baby, being held by David with what appeared to be genuine love. I picked up one of the photographs with trembling hands. It was David, no doubt, but a David I had never seen. His eyes shone differently. There was a softness in his expression that I had rarely witnessed in our relation. He was holding newborn Sophia, looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When was this photo taken? I asked, turning the image over to check for a date. March 2019, Isabel replied. 2 weeks after Sophia was born. My blood ran cold. In March 2019, David and I were planning our move to Los Angeles. He had convinced me to quit my job at an art gallery in New York because he had gotten an incredible opportunity in California. During that same period, he was here, playing happy father with another woman and another baby. Isabel, I said, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. Did you know about me? She shook her head. Not until recently. Gabriel told me about you a few weeks ago, when he found out David was married. I looked at Gabriel, who had remained silent during this whole devastating revelation. How did you find out about my marriage to David? Small communities talk, he said evasive. News travels, especially when it involves people who left. Lasting impressions? There was something in his answer that told me I wasn't getting the whole story. But, at that moment, I was too overwhelmed with the revelations about David's double life to press Gabriel for more detail. There's more, Isabel said hesitant. Something I found out recently. My stomach clenched. How could there be more? What other lies, what other betrayals had David orchestrated? Isabel looked at Gabriel again, as if asking for permission or encouragement. He nodded gravely. 2 weeks ago, a woman came to see me, Isabel continued. Her name is Maria. She lives in Boise, about 2 hours south of here. I felt nausea spreading through my stomach. And Maria was also involved with David. She has a son by him too. A 4-year-old boy named Julian. The world stopped. Completely stopped. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. David didn't just have one secret family. He had at least, maybe more. How is that possible? I whispered, more to myself than to them. David is very good at compartmentalizing his life, Gabriel said, speaking for the first time in several minutes. He tells different stories to different people, creates separate identities. To you, he probably said he was traveling for work. To Isabel, he said he had business in Los Angeles. To Maria, he probably made up another story completely. The pieces started to fit together in a painful and clear way. The prolonged absence, always with vague explanations about business, the money that appeared and disappeared from our accounts, his reluctance to introduce me to certain people or include me on certain trips, his insistence on keeping our relationship private even after marriage. Isabel, I managed to ask, when was the last time you saw David? 3 months ago, she replied. He showed up here one night, desperate. He said he was in trouble, that dangerous people were after him. He asked for money, but I had nothing to give. That's when he told me he was married to you. He told you about me? He said he had married an artist from New York. Isabel nodded. He said you were pregnant and that he needed to protect you from his business problem. But the way he talked about it, it didn't sound like love, Em. It sounded more like you were just another complication in his already complicated life. Every word was like the casual way David had apparently discussed our life, our baby, our marriage with his ex-fiancée, as if we were just another problem to solve. But what Isabel said last, Gabriel murmured, was what really made me decide you needed to know the truth. Isabel took a deep breath before continuing. Emily, when David was here 3 months ago, he mentioned that you weren't the only one who was pregnant. Maria was also expecting a second child of his. My vision started to darken at the edges. What do you mean? I think your baby isn't the only child David has on the way, Isabel said gently, but firmly. And based on how he abandoned Sophia and me, and based on what Maria told me about how he treats her and Julian, I'm afraid he's planning to abandon all of us. I felt like I was drowning. David didn't just have a history of abandonment. He had an established pattern, a routine of seducing women, building families, and then disappearing when things got too complicated or when a new opportunity arose. And I was just the latest in a line of women he had used and discarded. Back at the cabin, my mind couldn't stop processing everything I had discovered. Gabriel drove in silence for most of the way, occasionally looking at me with concern when he noticed I was lost in dark thoughts. What Isabel had told me had completely turned my understanding not only of David, but of our entire life together, inside out. Every memory I had considered precious now seemed tainted by doubt. When David told me he loved me for the first time, how many other women were hearing the same words? When he proposed to me, was he planning to do the same with Maria, or looking for other potential victims? Our honeymoon in Hawaii, had it just been a stop on an elaborate tour of lies and betrayal? Gabriel avoided pressing me with questions or trying to comfort me with empty words. He seemed to intuitively understand that I needed space to process, to let reality sink into my mind before trying to move forward. His sensitivity made me think that he himself had gone through some kind of devastating betrayal. At night, I sat near the fireplace with a cup of tea that had long since grown cold in my hand. Gabriel was arranging some firewood, but I could feel that he was watching me discreetly, waiting for me to speak when I was ready. "Gabriel," I said finally, my voice sounding strange after hours of silence. "You said David betrayed the trust of someone close to you. Were you talking about Isabel?" He stopped moving the firewood and straightened up slowly. "Not exactly," he replied, but didn't elaborate. "Then who was it?" Gabriel walked to the window and stared into the darkness outside for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried an emotional weight I hadn't heard before. "My sister," he said simply. I felt my heart "Your sister, Hope." She was 22 when she met David. She was studying nursing at the University of Portland, working 2 shifts a week at a free clinic. She was the kindest person I've ever known. Gabriel paused, and I saw his shoulders tense. David convinced her to drop out of school to help him with his business. He said they were going to make a lot of money together, that she wouldn't have to work so hard and what happened? Hope used her college savings, $5,000 she had saved by working was 15, to invest in what David called a unique opportunity. He said it was an import-export business, that she would be his partner. Gabriel turned to face me, and I saw a raw pain in his eyes that made me want to cry. The money disappeared in 2. David said there were complications with the suppliers, that it was just a temporary setback. Hope believed him because she loved him, completely, unconditional. Did she know about the other women? Not at the time. David was very careful to keep their lives separate. To Hope, he was an ambitious entrepreneur who was going to lift her out of poverty. She went so far as to lie to our family about where she was getting money for her new things, because David had convinced her they needed to keep their relationship private until the business took off. The story was making me physically ill. David had used the exact same tactics on me. The insistence on privacy, the promises of future wealth, the emotional manipulation disguised as protection. What happened to Hope? Gabriel closed his eyes for a moment, as if the memory was too painful to face. When she finally confronted David about the missing money, he said there were more complications, but that if she could get more money, just a little more, he could fix everything. And she did. Hope borrowed money from local loan sharks, dangerous people who charged impossible interest. She got another $3,000 and gave it to David. Gabriel paused, taking a deep breath. 3 days later, he disappeared. Completely. He changed apartment, changed his phone number, vanished. And your sister? Hope was left owing $3,000 to people who don't accept. She tried to negotiate, to explain that she had been scammed, but they didn't care about the details. They wanted their money back, with interest. I felt a shiver run down my spine. What did she do? She went back to nursing, took on more jobs, tried to pay the debt little by little, but the interest grew faster than she could pay. In 6 months, the $3,000 had become almost $10,000. Gabriel returned to the fireplace, but didn't sit down. He stood there, absent-mindedly poking the embers with a poker. "Where is she now?" "Hope disappeared 2 years ago," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "One night, she left a note saying she couldn't live with the shame and fear anymore. She said she was going to find a way to fix everything, but that we didn't know when she'd be back. You haven't heard anything from her?" Gabriel shook his head. "Nothing. I looked everywhere, hired a private investigator, offered rewards for information. It's like she just ... evaporated." Now I understood the deep sadness Gabriel carried, the way he looked at the photographs on the wall with such melancholy. One of them must be Hope, probably that young, beautiful woman on the beach that I had noticed. "Gabriel, I'm so sorry," I said, knowing the words were inadequate for the magnitude of his loss. "For 2 years, I also looked for David," he continued, "not to get the money back. That didn't matter anymore. But I wanted him to know what he had done to my sister's life. I wanted him to face the consequences of his action. And you never found him? Not until a few weeks ago, when I found out through mutual contacts that he was married and living in Los Angeles. That's when I started asking questions, putting pieces together about his current life. Gabriel looked me directly. That's how I found out about you, Emily, and about the other women. I remained silent, absorbing everything. Gabriel hadn't found me by chance on the road, or at least our connection wasn't completely accidental. There was a network of people David had hurt, an unofficial community of his victims. Why didn't you tell me this before? I asked. Because I wanted you to discover David's character gradually, through evidence, not just through my personal bitterness. Gabriel replied. If I had started by telling you about Hope, you might have thought it was just personal revenge. He was right. If Gabriel had bombarded me with accusations about David from the first moment, I probably would have become defensive, doubting his motivation. But now that you've seen Isabel, that you've heard about Maria and the other children, Gabriel continued, you can see that David has a pattern. It wasn't just bad luck or bad circumstances. It's who he is. As I rummaged through my things that night, trying to organize my thoughts and emotions, I found something I had completely forgotten. An envelope at the bottom of my suit, between some clothes I rarely wore. I didn't remember putting it there, and I certainly didn't remember what it might contain. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were 3 photographs and a piece of paper with an address written in a handwriting I recognized as David's. The photographs took my breath away. One showed David in front of a house I had never seen, hugging a woman who was neither me nor Isabel. The second photo showed the same woman holding a baby, with David beside her, both smiling at the camera. The third was of David playing with a small child in a park. The address on the paper was not ours. It was a house in the suburbs of Portland, in a city I had never visited. David had yet another family, another woman, other children. How many more would there be? The address on the paper burned my hands as if it were a live coal. All night long, I looked at it, memorizing every number, every letter of David's familiar handwriting. It was a house in Gresham, a suburb of Portland, that I knew vaguely. Why would David have an address there? Why would he hide photographs of another woman and other children? The next morning, I showed the photographs to Gabriel. I saw his expression harden as he studied the images, confirming his worst fears about the man who had destroyed his sister's life. We have to go there, he said finally. Are you sure? Emily, you need complete answers. You can't make decisions about your future and your son's future based on half-truths. Gabriel returned the photographs to my hands. Besides, if there are more families involved, they deserve to know the truth. The journey to Gresham took almost 4 hours of driving through landscapes that changed dramatically, from the snow-covered forests to the more densely populated suburbs of Portland. All the way, my anxiety grew. What would we find in that house? How many more of David's lies would be exposed? The address led us to a simple but well-kept house, with a small front yard and toys scattered on the lawn. It was the kind of house where a happy nuclear family could live. Exactly the kind of life I thought I was building with David. Gabriel parked on the other side of the street, and we watched the house for a few minutes. There were no signs of movement, but there was a car in the driveway and curtains open in the window. Do you want me to go first? Gabriel offered. I shook my head. No, this is something I have to face personally. We walked to the front door, and I rang the doorbell with a racing heart. I heard footsteps approaching, and then the door opened, revealing an elderly man with white hair and kind eyes. He looked at me with curiosity. Then his gaze moved to Gabriel, and finally returned to me. Can I help you? He asked in English. Sorry to bother you, I began hesitant. I'm looking for information about this address. My name is Emily, and I'm married to David Johnson. The effect of my words was immediate. The man's face contracted, and I saw a mixture of recognition, surprise, and what seemed to be compassion cross his. Ah, Emily, he said, and the fact that he knew my name made me even more unsettled. Please, come in. My name is Ernest. We entered a comfortable living room decorated with family photographs and furniture that had clearly been loved and used for many years. Ernest offered us something to drink, but we both declined. He sat in a worn armchair and studied us carefully. Emily, he said finally, I'm David's father. The world stopped. David had always told me his father was dead, that he had died when he was a child. It was one of the sad stories he told about his difficult childhood, one of the reasons I felt so much compassion for him. His father, I managed to whisper. Ernest nodded sadly. David told you I was dead, didn't he? I couldn't do more than nod. It's one of the many lies my son tells, Ernest continued, his voice heavy with deep sadness. David has been running from the truth, from his responsibilities, from his consequences, for over a decade. Why did he lie about you? Because I'm a constant reminder of who he really is, where he comes from, the choices. Ernest got up and walked to a table where there were several framed photographs. He picked one up and showed it to me. It was David as a child, smiling innocently at the camera. That boy had so much potential. He was smart, charming, could have been anything he wanted. What happened? David always wanted what others had, but he never wanted to work for it. When he was a teenager, he started lying about our financial situation to impress girls. He made up stories about being from a rich family, about having important connections. The lies got bigger and more elaborate over time. Gabriel, who had been silent until then, leaned forward. You know about the other women? Ernest sighed deeply. I know about Isabel and Sophia. I know about Maria and her children. I know about others, women whose names I don't even know, but who were hurt by my son. And you did nothing to stop him. What could I do? Ernest replied, his voice breaking slightly. I tried to confront him several times over the years. I offered him help, therapy, second chances. But David always had someone else to blame. Eventually, I stopped trying because I realized I was just enabling his behavior. Ernest returned to his armchair and looked me directly in the eyes. Emily, I know why David left you at that lake. My blood ran cold. You know about that? David called me the night he abandoned. He was in a panic, saying that people were after him, that he had made a bet that went wrong, that he needed to disappear for a while. What kind of bet? David got involved with organized crime years ago, Ernest explained, each word dropping like a bomb. He started small, money laundering, transport of illegal goods, but recently, he tried to steal from his own bosses. He believed he was smart enough not to get caught. The implications were terrifying. David was not just a serial liar and manipulator. He was a criminal who had put all his families in real danger. Ernest, I said, my voice trembling. Is he coming back? The old man shook his head slowly. David told me that leaving you was his way of protecting you from his consequences. But the truth is, abandoning you was the easiest way to get rid of the burden of a child and another family that he couldn't support or protect properly. So, he's never coming back? My son is a coward, Emily. He always runs when things get difficult. He'll never come back, because that would mean facing the consequences of his actions. And David has always avoided responsibility, Gabriel confirmed with a somber nod. It's exactly what he did to Hope, to Isabel, probably to all the other women. Ernest looked at me with genuine compassion. Emily, I'm sorry you got involved with my son. You seem like a good woman, and you don't deserve what he did to you. What should I do now? You have a choice to make, Ernest said gently. You can continue waiting for someone who is never coming back. You can continue hoping that David changes and becomes the man you thought he was. Or you can choose to live your own life, raise your son away from all this toxicity and violence. His words echoed in the silent room. It was the same choice Isabel had faced, that Maria was probably facing, that Hope had faced before she did. But there's one more thing you need to know, Ernest, his expression becoming even more serious. The people David robbed, they're not just going to forget. They're going to keep looking, and anyone associated with him could become a target. The fear that had been a constant presence since David abandoned intensified. This wasn't just about being a single mother or dealing with betrayal. It was about genuine physical danger. Gabriel and I exchanged glances. We were both thinking the same thing. I couldn't just go back to my normal life. David had put me in real danger, and I needed to take steps to protect my unborn child. Ernest, I asked, what do you advise me to do? David's father looked at me with a sadness that spoke of years of disappointment and heartbreak caused by his own son. Disappear, he said simply. Change your name, if necessary. Move somewhere where David and his associates would never think to look. Start over completely. It was a terrifying prospect, but also, in a strange way, liberating. The final truth, Ernest revealed, connected all the dots in a devastating way. David was on the run from a debt to criminals, people who would not hesitate to use violence to get what belonged to them. Leaving me at that lake had not just been cruelty, it had been his cowardly way of protecting himself while getting rid of the burden of a pregnant wife who could slow down his escape. Gabriel confirmed the story through his own sources. During the 2 years he had been looking for David, he had discovered connections to criminal groups that operated on both sides of the border. My husband was not just a serial liar and manipulator, he was a criminal who had put all his families in real danger. The people David robbed aren't just going to give up, Gabriel explained during our drive back. They have reputations to maintain, examples to make. Anyone associated with him could become a target. The magnitude of the situation I was in was beginning to fully form. I couldn't go back to our house in Los Angeles. Too obvious, too connected to the identity David knew. I couldn't count on my family in New York. That would put them in danger. I needed to disappear, reinvent myself, start a new life with my unborn baby. Gabriel, I said, when we got back to the cabin, I have to make a decision. He turned to look at me, and I saw in his eyes that he already knew what I was about to say. I can't wait for someone who is never coming back. I continued, the words gaining strength as I spoke. I can't keep living in the shadow of David's lies, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if I'm safe. What are you going to do? I'm going to start a new life, away from here, away from everything that connects me to David. I placed my hands on my belly, feeling my son move, as if responding to my decision. My baby deserves to grow up in peace, without the legacy of violence and deception that David would leave behind. Gabriel nodded approval. It's the right decision, Emily. Difficult, but right. Can you help me? I can help you with the documentation, with finding a place to live where you can start fresh. I have connections from my years of searching for hope, people who help others disappear when necessary. We spent the next week planning my new life. Gabriel helped me establish a new identity, documents that would allow me to work and live legally while keeping my distance from my past. We chose a small town in Vermont, far enough from the West Coast to be irrelevant to David's associate, but close enough to nature that I could find peace. What about you? I asked Gabriel on our last day together. What are you going to do? I'm going to keep looking for hope, he replied. Now that I know more about the extent of David's criminal activities, I have new leads to follow. Maybe she's hiding the same way you're going to hide. And if you find her, I'll give her the same choice I'm giving you. The chance to start over, to escape the shadow that David cast over all our lives. On my last night in the cabin, I sat near the fireplace and reflected on everything that had happened. 2 weeks ago, I was a married woman with a life I thought I understood. Now, I was about to become someone completely new, taking control of my destiny in a way I had never imagined necessary. The baby moved vigorously, as if sensing my resolve. I spoke softly to him, promising that we would find happiness together, away from the lies and danger that David had brought into our lives. We're going to be okay, I whispered to my unborn child. We're going to create a life based on truth, on safety, on genuine love. Gabriel had given me more than just practical help. He had given me the courage to face reality and make hard choices. His own loss had taught him about the importance of not waiting for other people to rescue. Mom was right, I said aloud, remembering my mother's words that had sustained me during my darkest moment on the road. No one can rescue you if you don't rescue yourself first. I was rescuing myself. I was rescuing my child, and for the first time in months, I felt genuine hope for the future. The next morning, Gabriel drove me to the bus station. We had agreed that it would be safer if we didn't stay in contact. Any connection to my old life could potentially lead David's enemies to my new location. Thank you, I said, when it was time to say goodbye, for everything, for saving my life, for showing me the truth, for helping me start over. Take care, Emily, Gabriel replied. You're stronger than you think. You're going to be a wonderful mother. When the bus pulled away from the station, watching Gabriel disappear in the distance, I felt a mixture of sadness and anticipation. I was leaving behind everything familiar, but I was also leaving behind all the pain and deception that had defined my recent life. The trip to Vermont took most of the day, giving me plenty of time to think about my future. I had some money that Gabriel had helped me access from accounts that David didn't know about, enough to get started in my new life. I had documents that would allow me to work as a freelance artist, using my skills to support myself and my child. Most importantly, I had a certainty that had been lacking from my life for so long. A certainty that I was finally making decisions based on truth rather than on lies, on my own strength rather than on dependence on someone who never had my best interests at heart. When the bus arrived in my new town, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in months. It was a small town surrounded by forests and mountains, with clean air and friendly people who didn't ask too many questions about newcomers seeking fresh starts. I found a small apartment above an art supply store, perfect for someone who wanted to work from home and maintain privacy. The owner of the building was an elderly woman named Rose, who reminded me of my mother, practical, kind, and wise enough to recognize when someone needed space to heal. "Artist?" she asked when she saw me looking at easels through the window of the store downstairs. "Yes," I replied, and it felt good to say it without qualifications or explanations about my husband's business or other complications. "I'm an artist. I chose to live." It was a simple decision in words, but profound in implication. After weeks of being passive, of being rescued, of having things happen to me rather than making them happen, I finally took control of my own narrative. I went back to the cabin one last time to get my few remaining possessions, the things that had seemed so important. Photos of David and me, wedding mementos, gifts he had given me, now seemed like artifacts from someone else's life. I left most of them behind, taking only practical items and a few art supplies that Gabriel had found for me. "Are you sure?" Gabriel asked one more time as he helped me pack. "I've never been more sure of anything in my..." I responded, and I meant it completely. I thanked Gabriel not just with words, but with a painting I had created during my recovery time. A landscape of the lake outside his cabin, but with warm sunlight breaking through clouds that had been gray in reality. It was my way of showing that even in the midst of darkness, hope could be found. "Keep it," I said, handing him the small canvas. "To remember that sometimes people can find their way to the light." Gabriel studied the painting with an emotion he rarely showed. "Emily, you're going to be fine. More than fine, you're going to thrive." For the first time in weeks, I genuinely believed. The journey to my new life was long, but filled with anticipation rather than dread. Each mile took me further from David's web of lies. Each moment brought me closer to genuine freedom. The baby seemed to sense my change in mood, moving more peacefully, as if he too was relieved to be heading toward something better. In my new town, I began a routine that was simple but satisfying. Mornings were spent painting landscapes and portraits that I could sell to local galleries and online. Afternoons were for walks through the country, breathing clean air and feeling my child grow stronger inside me. Evenings were for reading, planning, and preparing for motherhood on my own terms. For the first time, I started to paint not just what I saw, but what I felt. My art became more vibrant, more honest. I was creating from a place of authentic emotion rather than trying to please anyone or maintain any image. I started a new painting, the frozen lake from Gabriel's cabin, but with a sun rising in the background, casting golden light across the snow. It was symbolic of my own journey from darkness toward light, from deception toward truth, from dependence toward self-reliance. As I worked on this painting, I reflected on everything I had learned. David's abandonment, traumatic as it had been, was actually a gift. It had freed me from a life built on lies, had given me a chance to discover who I really was when not defined by someone else's expectations or deception. My story with David had indeed ended in the snow, exactly as I had thought during those terrifying first moments on the road. But my life, my real life, was just beginning. Every brushstroke on a canvas was a declaration of independence. Every day that passed without looking over my shoulder for danger was a victory. Every kick from my unborn child was a promise of a better future that we would create together. And Gabriel, maybe he wasn't just a stranger who had saved me that winter. Maybe he was exactly what I had needed him to be, a catalyst for my own transformation. a bridge between who I had been and who I was becoming. Sometimes, when painting near a window with afternoon light streaming through, I would think about him searching for his sister, hoping that he would find her safe somewhere, starting her own new life, free from David's damage. Sometimes I would wonder if David ever thought about any of us. Me, Isabel, Maria, Sofia, Julian, all the children he had abandoned. But those moments of curiosity passed quickly, replaced by gratitude that he was out of our lives permanently. My new beginning wasn't just about geographical location or legal identity. It was about a fundamental shift in how I understood myself and my capabilities. I had learned that I was stronger than I ever imagined, more resourceful, more resilient. The painting of the lake with the sunrise became my masterpiece. Not because it was technically perfect, but because it represented my rebirth. When I finally finished it, months later when my son was sleeping peacefully in his crib nearby, I felt a completion that went beyond art. I hung it in our small living room, where sunlight from real windows illuminated both the painted sunrise and my actual new life. My child would grow up seeing that image, understanding implicitly that darkness can give way to light, that people can save themselves, that new beginnings are always possible. And maybe, just maybe, someone else who found themselves lost and abandoned would see my story and find the courage for their own rescue, their own rebirth, their own choice to live fully and authentically despite the betrayals that had brought them to their knees. The life I was building was small, but genuine, quiet, but rich with possibility. It was exactly what I wanted it to be, because, for the first time, I was making all the choices myself, and that, I realized as I watched my son sleep peacefully in the sunlight streaming through our windows, was what true freedom looked like.